Imagine the world's very first empire, an audacious experiment in unity and power, rising from the fertile plains between two great rivers. What if I told you that about 5,000 years ago, a man born of humble origins dared to conquer dozens of city-states, weaving them into a single realm the likes of which history had never seen? What drove Sargon of Akkad to challenge the mighty kings of Sumer and claim the exalted title King of Sumer and Akkad? How do you govern a realm of diverse languages, faiths, and customs? What happens when ambition outpaces administration? When tribute demands outstrip the land's bounty? Could climate upheaval, palace intrigue, or the sheer scope of rule spell the empire's doom? In this documentary, we'll plunge into the rise of the world's first true empire, its breathtaking cultural triumphs, its revolutionary systems of administration, and the relentless forces that would eventually bring it crashing down. Stay with us as we uncover the epic saga of Akkad, where power was born and where it first began to unravel. Imagine the rich flat plains of southern Mesopotamia, land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, around 3000 BC. Here, the first human cities are rising. We call this land Sumer, where farming villages like Uruk and Eridu grew into walled city-states. By 2500 BC, city after city, Ur, Lagash, Kish, Uruk, and others boast mighty ziggurat temples, Bronze Age palaces, and scribes writing cuneiform on clay tablets. The Sumerians, a people of merchants and builders, have invented writing, the wheel, and a base 60-number system. Each city worships its own gods, Inanna of Uruk, Enlil of Nippur, and so on, and is ruled by its Ensi, or king. Yet these cities are often at war with each other over land and water rights. One ruler might burn a rival's walls one year, only to be attacked himself the next. The historical records even preserve epic tales of these struggles. For a time, Lugal-Zagizi of the city of Umma did unite much of Sumer, conquering Lagash, Kish, Ur, and Uruk, even reaching the Mediterranean coast. But his grip is loose, and his fury will soon be turned back against him by an ambitious young leader from outside Sumer's heartland. Meanwhile, other people have been moving into northern Mesopotamia. Semitic-speaking Akkadian tribes have settled to the north of the old Sumerian cities. In scribal archives of the late 3rd millennium, we already find Akkadian names and words alongside the Sumerian. At Tel Abu, Salabik, and Mari, Akkadian scribes write in cuneiform. The languages mix. Sumerian remains the sacred tongue of the priests, while Akkadian, a Semitic language related to later Hebrew and Arabic, starts to spread. By the mid-2300s BC, a fusion of cultures is underway, but still there is no single empire. The region is a patchwork of city-states and small kingdoms, each scrapping for its own survival in the fertile but fierce land between rivers. All this changed with the rise of Sargon of Akkad. His story straddles fact and legend. According to Babylonian legends, Sargon was born of humble stock, perhaps even set adrift as an infant in a reed basket on a river, then raised by a water carrier. The legends say he started life as Aki's gardener, and later became cupbearer to the powerful king of Kish, Ur-Zababa. In truth, Sargon, whose name means the true king, probably held a high court position in Kish, an office that put him close to the king's bodyguard and gave him command over workers who could turn into soldiers. In around 2340 BC, Sargon took his chance. The great king Lugal-Zagizi had become rich and arrogant, but he had enemies and overreached. Sargon marched the armies of Akkad south and crushed Lugal-Zagizi's forces at the Battle of Uruk. He captured Lugal-Zagizi and marched him on a leash to the temple of the god Enlil in Nippur, a dramatic symbol that Mesopotamia's kings now bowed before a new ruler. Sargon declared himself king of Kish, which was a traditional title, signaling overlordship of all Sumer. He had effectively deposed Lugal-Zagizi and ended the Sumerians' last united rule. From that moment, Sargon set out to create something no one had done before, a true empire. Fragmented ancient records, often stored as later copies, tell how Sargon's armies smashed city walls, one by one, in lower Mesopotamia. He claimed to have defeated 34 different states in southern Babylonia, throwing down city gates, and taking 50 local rulers hostage. One dramatic image from later king lists even describes him cleansing his weapons in the sea, suggesting that under Sargon's rule the Euphrates stretched all the way to the Persian Gulf. Sargon did not stop at Sumer, however. According to his inscriptions, he marched north and east as well, conquering the city of Mari on the middle Euphrates and the important trading outpost of Tuttle. He marched west into Syria, capturing Ebla in the mountains of what is now northern Syria. He boasted of sending ships to the great cedar forests on the Lebanon mountains and of returning with exotic goods. Even the distant kingdoms of Elam to the east in what is now Iran and a place called Magan, thought to be the deserts of Ammon, are named in his victory texts. In antiquity, Sargon's empire would later be said to stretch from the silver mines of Anatolia to the lapis lazuli fields of Afghanistan, although those poetic lines may mix history and legend. To hold this vast territory, Sargon took bold steps. He claimed not only titles like King of Sumer and Akkad, but also credited himself as the chosen vassal or priest of the major gods, Ishtar of Uruk, Zababa of Kish, Anu the sky god, and Lil of Nippur. He even carried the family influence of his reign into religion by appointing his daughter, Enheduanna, as high priestess of the moon god Nana at Uar. Enheduanna's Sumerian hymns to Inanna and others survive to this day, making her the first author in history whose name we know. Through such moves, Sargon wove his dynasty into the fabric of the land's culture. Finally, after decades of campaigning, Sargon claimed a peace settled by tribute. He boasted of placing Akkadian governors and officials in the conquered cities, replacing local kings with loyal Akkadians. Everywhere, from the Persian Gulf northward, he set up garrisons. He built fortresses along the rivers and canals to control the empire's vital wheat harvests, ensuring grain could flow to his capital. War chariots and battalions kept the trade routes safe. Sargon even built at least one known canal to help move water and ships. For about 56 years, Sargon reigned in Akkad, his own mysterious capital, whose exact location we still do not know, but which lay somewhere between Kish and Sippar on the Euphrates. He erected statues of himself and placed cult images on the shores of the Mediterranean as monuments to his victories. He carried riches from conquered lands back home, copper from Magan, timber from Lebanon, precious gems from far places, to fill his palace and temples. Under Sargon's leadership, Mesopotamia truly became an interconnected world, for the first time united under one man. After the triumphant rise to power of Sargon of Akkad, he turned his attention to organizing his vast empire. To maintain control, he divided his realm into provinces, each governed by trusted officials sworn to Akkad. These governors ensured the empire's laws and taxes were enforced across cities that had once been independent. To unify his diverse territories, Sargon ordered scribal schools to teach the Akkadian language and cuneiform script, creating a common system for record-keeping. His administrators meticulously documented military campaigns, trade agreements, and temple offerings year by year, laying the foundation for sophisticated bureaucracies in the future. Trade flourished under his rule, with precious goods like Anatolian silver, Afghan lapis lazuli, Arabian copper, and Syrian cedars pouring into Mesopotamia. Long supply caravans connected distant cities, reshaping everyday life across the region. Sargon also implemented key measures to strengthen his administration. He constructed networks of walled storehouses, often positioned at river crossings or in newly founded towns, to collect and protect grain from each district. These fortresses doubled as supply depots, keeping his armies well-provisioned during campaigns. To govern effectively, he appointed Akkadian Ensi or governors in conquered cities, ensuring loyalty to the crown while allowing local temple priests to continue their religious roles under the king's ultimate authority. Standardization was another priority. Weights, measures, and calendars were made consistent across the empire. Sargon even introduced a shared irrigation maintenance schedule, enabling farmers throughout Mesopotamia to coordinate their efforts and boost food production. Militarily, Sargon maintained a professional army stationed at strategic locations, like Tel Brak in the north and Megan in the south. These garrisons patrolled borders and quelled rebellions, drawing on a diverse force that included Sumerian speakers, conscripts, and mercenaries from subdued territories. To sustain his empire's growth, he established a tribute system, requiring conquered cities to pay in grain, livestock, gold, or labor. These resources fueled grand construction projects in Akkad, such as walls, temples, and canals, and funded further military expeditions. The spoils of war, in turn, supported the empire's expansion, leaving a lasting mark on Mesopotamian civilization. Sargon's rule left one notable legacy for administration. He took on the old Mesopotamian title, King of Sumer and Akkad, symbolizing that he claimed the authority of the ancient Sumerian tradition as well as the new Akkadian people. In practice, southern city-states, Sumer, likely kept much of their local autonomy. Temple economies and local customs continued. But politically, the day of independent city kings was over. By about 2300 BC, when Sargon was in his prime, his empire is said, in later tradition, to include some 65 different lands and peoples. We may never know exactly how much of the distant claims were true in his day. The lists that include places like Crete were written many centuries later, probably as legendary exaggerations. Still, archaeologists have found Akkadian inscriptions and sealings from the empire's early period at sites, scattered from southern Iraq up to the upper Tigris and into Elam. That distribution, up to 600 miles as the crow flies, shows an impressive sphere of influence. Yet controlling all that was a struggle. Ancient texts mention that in his old age, Sargon had to fight off revolts from all the lands of his empire. There is a report, probably from generations later, that once he was besieged in the city of Akkad by a coalition, but he marched out, smashed the rebel army, and triumphed again. Another account says tribes called Suburtu in the mountains to the north later rose against him. Sargon says he settled their habitations, a cryptic way of saying he subdued them too. In each case, he restored order, but historians today see these hints that managing an empire so vast was an ongoing battle. What we do know is that wherever Sargon's power reached, it left behind new bonds. Statues with his name in far-flung temples, scribal schools teaching the Akkadian language, and cities graced with trade and tribute. He even declared himself anointed priest of Enlil and the great Ensi of Anu, tying his dynasty into the divine world order. It was a fusion of the old Sumerian ways and the new Semitic leadership. The world under the Akkadian kings was rich with cultural innovation. Art and sculpture flourished. Craftsmen carved great stone steels and statues in diorite and basalt, depicting the kings towering over enemies. The most famous of these is the victory stele of Naram-Sin, that is Sargon's grandson. It shows a horned helmeted king, godlike, leading his soldiers up a mountain. While terrified, Lalubi tribespeople flee below. Even under Sargon's reign, artists began blending Akkadian motifs with traditional Sumerian ones. Cylinder seals, for example, show Akkadian war scenes and religious processions carved into tiny barrels of stone. The Akkadian language itself became a powerful unifying force. Before Akkad's rise, Akkadian Semitic dialects were spoken by nomads and city dwellers in the north. Now the kings made Akkadian the language of administration and diplomacy. They still use the old cuneiform script of Sumer, but wrote in their own tongue. In time, Akkadian would even replace Sumerian for everyday use in southern Iraq. Important texts like royal inscriptions and trade records were written in Akkadian. We also find bilingual tablets from this era. Sumerian on one side, Akkadian on the other, reflecting a bilingual scribal world. One of the most extraordinary cultural legacies of this time is in Hejana, daughter of Sargon. As high priestess of the moon god in Uar, she wrote lyrical hymns in Sumerian celebrating the goddess Inanna and others. These poems, thousands of lines long, are among the oldest literary works known. In Hejwana even praised her father in verse, helping to craft his image as a divine ruler. She is often hailed as the first author in history because her name is attached to the text she composed. Her works would be copied for centuries after, showing that the blending of Akkadian rule and Sumerian tradition had profound artistic results. Religion and ideology also saw innovation. Sargon and his successors presented their kingship as almost preordained by the gods. New temple-building projects honored both old Sumerian deities and the imperial dynasty. The priests of high gods now took oaths by Naram-Sin, implying that the king himself had divine standing. Naram-Sin would later go further and call himself god of Akkad, the first Mesopotamian king ever to do so. During the empire, priests and people began to invoke the king's name in rituals, blurring the line between deity and king. Technology and knowledge likewise advanced under Akkad's auspices. The Akkadians inherited and expanded Sumer's brilliance in mathematics and astronomy. They continued to use the sexagesimal, a base 60 counting system, dividing hours in circles, as we do today. Scribal schools multiplied, producing a generation of literate administrators who kept meticulous records. Weights and measures were standardized to facilitate empire-wide trade. Though the Bronze Age culture itself isn't thought to have invented new machines, the empire enabled widespread use of existing inventions, like the potter's wheel and plow, by giving craftsmen and farmers a stable system in which to operate. Together, these achievements left a lasting cultural mark. Under the Akkadian Empire, arts reached new heights. Literature celebrated deities and rulers alike, and ideas, from writing to religion, spread across the Near East. The mixing of Sumerian and Semitic elements created a dynamic, eclectic culture that many future civilizations would draw upon. When Sargon died at an old age, perhaps around 2279 BC, he left behind a vast kingdom and a powerful legacy, but also the seeds of trouble. The throne passed to his son Ramish. Ramish's reign was a full-on firefight. Almost immediately, cities that Sargon had defeated saw their chance and rebelled. Ramish's inscriptions boast of fierce campaigns to retake cities like Uar, Umma, Lagash, Adab, Dur, and Kazalu. He writes matter-of-factly of bloodshed on an enormous scale, tens of thousands of enemies slain, others captured or enslaved, apparently to terrify any who might rise against him. Archaeologists even have records, like the Ramish Prism, that list the number of people killed or driven away. Yet Ramish's victories came at great cost. Nearly every southern city he conquered left a trail of destruction behind. He may have been trying to make an example. He rebuilt some temples, but wiped out others, showing that he meant to break the old power structures. However, the constant warfare made his own position tenuous. After only about 9 years on the throne around 2278 to 2270 BC, Ramish was assassinated, possibly by palace conspirators. His short reign shows how a quickly expanded empire begins to crack as soon as the founder is gone. Ramish was succeeded by his elder brother Manish-Tushu. Manish-Tushu seems to have had a quieter start. Around 2269 BC, he took the throne and held it for about 14 years. One of his notable achievements was in naval warfare. In an extraordinary feat, Manish-Tushu's forces fought a fleet battle against a coalition of 32 kings along the Persian Gulf Coast, probably around modern UAE or Oman. The sources say he captured the Gulf cities and brought them under Akkadian control. This opened richer sea trade for Akkad with Dilmun, now Bahrain, and Magan, now Oman. Manishtushu is also famous for commissioning an inscribed obelisk, a tall stone pillar, that records his legal decrees and building grants. His records show a more law and order approach, perhaps trying to consolidate what Sargon had built. Yet, like his brother, Manishtushu met a violent end. He too was killed in a palace coup after dozens of years of rule. The next ruler was Naram-Sin, son of Manishtushu and grandson of Sargon. Naram-Sin reigned for about 2254 to 2218 BC, would become the greatest of Akkad's kings. Almost immediately, he faced rebellion at home. However, he crushed each revolt with ruthless efficiency. Naram-Sin's reign marks the zenith of Akkadian power. He carried the empire farther, conquering the Lalubi mountain tribes in the Zagros range, taking lucrative cities like Ebla and Armanum in Syria. And eventually, Egyptian sources claim he even led raids towards Canaan. To garrison his territory, he built a royal citadel at Tel Brak in modern northeast Syria, a strategic crossroads. From there, he could project power in the north. But Naram-Sin also did something unprecedented. He elevated himself to a god. On his famous victory stele, he is shown wearing a horned helmet, the symbol of divinity, and towering 3 times taller than his subjects. He took the title king of the 4 quarters of the world. In texts from Nippur and other cities, priests began swearing oaths by Naram-Sin himself as if by a deity. He called himself God of Akkad. Would have been unthinkable, a human king being treated as a god. Now happened. Naram-Sin may have been aiming to inspire awe or possibly stabilize the empire by religious authority. Interestingly, later texts tell a cautionary tale. The Sumerian king list and some royal hymns suggest that calling himself a god angered the Sumerian pantheon, which eventually brought divine punishment on Akkad. Whether that's historical or moralizing myth is hard to say, but it's an ancient clue that Naram-Sin's extraordinary claims were controversial, even to contemporaries. Beyond the divine pretensions, Naram-Sin's reign was orderly. Tablets from his time show a highly planned economy. Grain rations distributed in measured jugs, taxes paid in barley and labor, and huge temple projects funded by the treasury. It seems the land was prosperous, maybe aided by several good harvests or new irrigation. The king was generous to temples and cities, building at least the Enlil temple at Nippur and an Inanna temple at Zabalam, as noted in your names. However, beneath that prosperity, other problems were brewing. By late in Naram-Sin's life, the trouble began to re-emerge. Around 2217 BC, his son and successor, Shar-Kali-Sheri, sometimes called Sarkali-Sari, inherited a vast but fragile realm. Shar-Kali-Sheri ruled for about 25 years. That's about 2217 to 2193 BC. But his time on the throne saw the empire start to unravel. Early on, he continued his father's pattern and even adopted divine titles himself, often writing his name with the god symbol. But nearly all sources agree that his reign faced increased disorder. City-states in the south rebelled again, and fierce new enemies appeared on the borders. Assyriologist sources tell us that Shar-Kali-Sheri had to fight off repeated incursions by the Gudians, a tribal people from the Zagros Mountains. He also recorded campaigns against the Martu, Amorites from the west, and the Magan, Omanites again. His year names, the way dates were recorded in Akkadian, mention battles far and wide. Despite some victories, nothing he did could fully restore order. By the time he died around 2193 BC, one later tradition claims all the lands that Sargon's grandfather had conquered had slipped away. After Shar-Kali-Sheri, the central authority in Akkad nearly collapsed. The Sumerian king list laments a confusing interlude. It names 4 short-reigned rulers, Ilyalu, Imta, Nainam, and someone else, each lasting only a year or less. This suggests a power struggle at the very top. Then came Du-Du, who ruled from approximately 2189 BC to 2169 BC, perhaps an earlier family member who managed to restore something like unity. Dudu and his son Shuturul, who ruled from approximately 2168 BC to 2119 BC, are the last two kings named of Akkad, and they appear to have held the title king of Sumer and Akkad. They ruled from the old city of Akkad, or perhaps Uruk, some scholars say, and tried to assert control over the southern cities. For a time, they held off the waves of chaos, but only a great effort. Behind them, the road to Akkad was already crumbling. By mid-22nd century BC, the region broke into fragments. Independent city-states like Lagash, Uar, Umma reclaimed their old autonomy. Meanwhile, a new group called the Gudians seized the opportunity. The Gudians, possibly mountain clans from what is now western Iran, swept down and took control of many parts of Akkad's former territory. Gudian chiefs ruled from cities like Adab and even the heart of Akkad itself. Later Babylonian sources paint the Gudian period as a dark age, claiming they neglected agriculture, let animals roam free, and caused famines. By 2112 BC, it was clear Akkad's imperial glory was over. The last rulers, Dudu and Shuturul, had disappeared, and the throne was empty. In the power vacuum, new dynasties arose, notably the third dynasty of Uar, Uarnemu and his heirs, who reunified southern Mesopotamia. Uarnemu would eventually drive the Gudians out and claim the title king of Sumer and Akkad for himself, a pointed nod to the old empire's name. The decline and collapse of the Akkadian Empire, once a glorious and powerful entity, is a subject of much debate among historians. By piecing together clues from archaeology, climate science, and ancient texts, we can begin to understand the factors that led to its downfall. It wasn't a single event like an earthquake or a decisive battle, but rather a perfect storm of troubles that overwhelmed the empire. One of the key factors was political turmoil. From the reign of Rimish onward, each ruler faced numerous rebellions. The sheer number of uprisings in both the southern regions and far-flung provinces suggests that local elites were increasingly resistant to Akkadian rule. Every change of king became an opportunity for provinces to break away. By the time of Shar-Kalisheri, the empire was beset by revolts on multiple frontiers and internal coups, such as those that marked the fates of Rimish and Manish-Tushu, further destabilized the central power. Economic strain also played a significant role. Maintaining an empire of such vast size required constant resources. Rulers demanded heavy tributes from conquered territories, and these resources were poured into ambitious building projects and maintaining large armies. Over time, the treasury may have been stretched thin. There is evidence that trade routes to distant lands became less reliable or even dangerous, potentially cutting off vital supplies. If grain surpluses fell or caravans were attacked, the state's ability to support its armies and officials would have been severely weakened. Invasions and migrations added to the empire's woes. The Gudians, a group from the Zagros Mountains whose exact nature remains unclear due to their scarce records, launched a series of incursions around 2200 BC, overrunning many southern cities. At the same time, nomadic Amorite tribes moved into the region, establishing petty kingdoms. Archaeologically, many urban centers from this period show signs of destruction or abandonment, indicating that foreign pressure was mounting on multiple borders, while the central authority wavered. Perhaps one of the most intriguing theories is that an abrupt climate change dealt the final blow. Starting around 2200 BC, evidence suggests that Mesopotamia experienced a prolonged drought, known as the 4.2 kilo-year event. Studies of ancient soil, lake sediments, and tree rings indicate that rain-fed agriculture in northern Mesopotamia, including the Jazira and Habur plains, collapsed. Archaeological findings, such as deep layers of wind-blown sand at Syrian sites, confirmed that the land dried and eroded. This drought was part of a wider pattern affecting regions from the Indus Valley to Egypt. The consequences were dire. Northern grain granaries, which had supplied southern cities, withered, and reservoirs and canals silted up. Without local food surpluses, cities like Akkad and Nippur struggled to feed their populations, leading to famine. Some texts from slightly later periods, such as UR3 accounts, hint at such conditions, mentioning the killing of oxen and no grain in the fields. Tribes with flocks would have migrated from the parched uplands to the river valleys, clashing with desperate city dwellers. In essence, the city and state resources were starving out just as invaders pressed in. Closely linked to the climate issue was the problem of agricultural decline. Mesopotamian fields relied heavily on irrigation from the rivers, but over centuries of intense cultivation, the land risked salinization, salt buildup from irrigation water that can ruin soil fertility. Some scholars suggest that by 2200 BC, parts of Sumer had too much salt in the topsoil, making farming increasingly difficult even if water was available. A severe climate spike would have only exacerbated this strain. No single source explicitly states why the Akkadian Empire collapsed. Instead, it was likely a combination of these factors. Ancient literature provides a mythic perspective. One Sumerian writing, often called the Curse of Akkad, imagines that Naram-Sin's impiety angered the gods, who sent Gudians and plague as punishment. A later king list poetically describes how rulers became as common as kings of Uruk, metaphorically capturing the chaos and fragmentation of the time. By around 2150 BC, imperial control was a distant memory. The city of Akkad itself disappeared from the historical record, along with most of the empire's former administration. The once mighty palaces of the Bronze Age fell silent, and Mesopotamia entered a so-called Dark Age for several centuries, until new kings like Ur-Nammu of Ur emerged to build another southern empire. The Akkadian Empire may have been short-lived, but its influence was immense. First and foremost, it proved that empires were possible. Sargon's model, one powerful capital controlling many peoples, would be emulated by nearly every later Near Eastern state, Babylonians, Assyrians, and even Persians. From 2,000 years after Sargon, we have no example of all of southern Mesopotamia not being united under one ruler or dynasty, and that tradition started here. Even after Akkad's fall, certain traditions endured. The very title king of Sumer and Akkad became a standard claim of legitimacy. Ur-Nammu, then his grandson Hammurabi of Babylon, and even Assyrian kings hundreds of years later would use it. The name Akkad lived on in language. By the 2nd millennium BC, Akkadian was the word for the Semitic dialects used by Babylonians and Assyrians. It was a scholarly language long after everyday speakers had switched to later tongues, just as Latin remained a liturgical language in Europe. Culturally, the fusion achieved under Akkad, mixing Sumerian and Semitic ideas, shaped Mesopotamian civilization forever. In Hedjwana's hymns, for example, left a template for religious poetry and the idea that a king could be commemorated in song. The art style of the Akkadian period, masterfully realized on Naram-Sin stele and other monuments, became the high classical model for royal imagery. Future Mesopotamian rulers, even as late as Persia, would mimic Akkadian royal portraits and symbols. Politically, Sargon became a legend. In fact, he's one of the few ancient Near Eastern figures to be indirectly named in the Bible. Genesis 10 mentions Cush fathered Nimrod, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, and Akkad. In medieval times, Jewish and Muslim scholars debated whether Akkadian stories inspired the legend of Nimrod, the mighty hunter. In Mesopotamia itself, folk stories about Sargon survived in scribal traditions. The legend of Sargon, telling of his miraculous infancy and divine rise, was still copied in New Babylonian archives around 700 BC as a text to be read. Archaeology, of course, has rediscovered Akkad only in the last 2 centuries. Excavations at Sumerian cities turned up cuneiform tablets of the old Akkadian period, once mysterious but now matched to Sargon's line in the king list. Statues and inscriptions bearing his name were found, like a famous head carved in limestone showing the parted hair of Sargon of Akkad. The very city of Akkad has eluded discovery, but we know it must lie beneath the sand somewhere in central Iraq. Each dig in a region yields more Akkadian seals, tablets, and monuments, piecing together how this first empire once worked. For all its mystery, some things remain unanswered. We still don't know exactly why the empire collapsed. Climate change is a convincing clue, but how the armies of Akkad reacted to famine is left to interpretation. We haven't found Akkad's treasury vaults or palace ruins to learn how it was managed from inside. And we have only sparse evidence about the Akkadian language spoken by ordinary people. Most texts are royal or religious. Even Naram-Sin's legendary deification is debated by scholars as either a political strategy or true religious innovation. What endures clearly is this. The Akkadian Empire was history's first multi-ethnic empire. It showed that a single ruler could unite diverse lands under one crown, leaving behind a vision of kingship that lasted millennia. It transformed the tiny city-states of Sumer and Akkad into a world where ideas, writing, art, trade, law could flow freely. In that sense, every later empire owes a debt to the bold experiment begun by Sargon and his successors. Their story of ambition and innovation, but also of hubris and collapse, reads to us now like an epic saga, the kind that has echoed down the ages.